Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly look at the news agenda. Before I introduce guests this week and also the topics, just another note about our upcoming national conference, our second one, which this year is in Birmingham. It's on the 22nd of April. That's the day before St George's Day. We've got a great lineup of speakers. Now, please do get your tickets for that. It would be great to see you there. Just go to the link under this video and you can buy a ticket or indeed just find out further details about it. 22nd of April, that's the NCF conference. Hope to see you there. Now, this week, I'm joined by, as usual, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our senior fellow and also royal historian, and the chairman of Migration Watch, Alp Mehmet, who's a long-standing friend of the channel. Gentlemen, this week I wanted to talk about two topics mostly, but three if we have time. First of all, obviously, momentous events in America, unprecedented indeed, with the arrest, indictment of President Donald Trump. Also this week, we've had the grooming gangs coming back into the headlines again, and a certain amount of promises being made by Sir William Braverman and also by the Prime Minister on how it should be dealt with. And there's been a left-wing reaction as well to that. And finally, we're going to look a little bit at what AI means for the future. Is it going to be a disaster for mankind, or is it going to produce a paradise? I think I know which one, but anyway. I want to start, if I may, actually, Rafe, with Donald Trump. Now, he's been before the court for the first time. I think the second time is not until December or something. But he's up on 34 charges. Is this going to be a good thing for him or a bad thing?
Well, it's going to be both. What the thinking, I think, behind the Democrat side, we have to remember that New York is the Democrat state, and it's likely that he wouldn't have been indicted had a grand jury been found, say, elsewhere in New York, even in New York State, say in Staten Island, for example, let alone in, say, Texas or Florida. And to indict somebody with a grand jury, you only need to have a majority. You only have to have probable cause and a majority, not unanimous consent of the grand jury.
Case.
So it's a very thin case. It's actually the thinnest of the four potential indictments that there are supposed to be. Though two other indictments are going to be about Mar-a-Lago and the holding of classified documents and so forth. So, but of these four potential indictments, this one is the shakiest, and it's quite questionable as to why it's been being put forward. None of these 34 charges are actually really felonies. These are all misdemeanors, and it's been a great stretch of the legal system to make them into actual felonies. So it's clear that there's a political motivation behind this particular indictment. 70% of independents have actually believe that this is also a political indictment, a political motivated indictment. We know how divided American society is, but when you look at independents, 70% of them can see it for what it is. Even Mitt Romney, the former presidential candidate who twice voted to impeach and convict Donald Trump, has said that this is the use of the political system, of the judicial system, to advance a political agenda, and it's very dangerous to actually try to criminalize your political opposition. Now, the thinking behind the Democrat side on all of this, I think, is that they know that this is going to galvanize the Trump Republican base very much, so that it's almost inevitable, if this happens, that there'll be a surge of support for him in the primaries, which may indeed lead to him now winning the nomination. But that when it comes to the general election, the wider population will be so turned off by these indictments, not knowing the full nitty-gritty of why this is happening, that he'll actually lose the general election, because they would much prefer Trump to be the nominee rather than someone like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who holds very similar views but is more palatable to a wider section of the population. So there is, I think, clear political motivation here, which also explains in part why this investigation has been going on for 5 years, and they've now suddenly, just a few months away from the primaries, are coming out with this now.
Yes, it is. I mean, it's been commented on this week, actually, Alp, that this it could show two things about America. I mean, either that it's in robust good health, i.e. that a former president is actually not above the law, and he's being brought quite rightly to justice, or it could show, which I think is what Rafe sort of outlined, that in fact it's in a terrible state. In fact, the idea of institutions which are neutral, etc., completely now gone because this is just a political manoeuvre. Where would you stand on that?
Well, all sorts of thoughts. I agree with so much of what Rafe just said. We sometimes make the mistake, I think, of judging the United States the way we would judge what happens in this country and what politicians in this country do. And the fact is that the United States is very different. They do things differently. They have a different system. I mean, like everyone else, I have mixed feelings about Trump. I do believe that he's a genuine friend of the United Kingdom. I don't think we should forget that.
Yeah.
President Biden, who was it said about a French president, the jury's out. I think that he very clearly has his doubts about the United Kingdom.
He's not even bothering to come to the coronation, is he?
Well, I'm not so sure that in itself is a slight. I don't know, perhaps he's unwell, perhaps he doesn't feel strong enough to travel. Who knows? The other thing I would say, yesterday when it was all happening and the great build-up, I compared what was going on say GB News to what was happening on the BBC.
Yes.
And it was interesting how the BBC focused on those who were Trump to be locked up, throw away the key. There was a lot of animosity, but there were a lot of people who felt very strongly.
Yeah.
You turn to GB News and it was the other end. Yeah. Well, he's got a lot of support and look how he's taking it, how stoic he is. The BBC, he's down, he was depressed, he was angered, he was all these things. So the perceptions to a certain extent in this country are coloured by the media we have. What will happen in the States, I think on balance, even they will probably find it difficult to actually try Trump in the end. I don't know, maybe wrong. I think they will. And in the end, Trump will probably come out on top. And if anything, a bit like Putin really and Ukraine, he did it in order to stop NATO expanding. Well, if the Americans and the Democrats are now doing it in order to stop Trump, I think it will possibly have the opposite effect.
Yes, interestingly, from what I can see, is that Ron DeSantis, who was being, possibly because it's what you just said, possibly because so many people here would prefer him, that we tend to think, but he's the real kind of contender, for the nomination. But in fact, he seems to be just going down a little bit, and Trump is sort of going up in terms of opinion polls at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lesson of history of the last 10 years that whoever Europeans tend to think is actually in the ascendancy is nowhere near that in America. In much the same way that people in Europe just couldn't conceive or understand of how Trump could be elected. If you're in America, particularly in this heartland, it was obvious he was going to be elected. So we tend here to view America through very different spectacles to the reality on the ground. And you're quite right. I mean, I thought it would be rather interesting if Trump had refused to surrender himself to New York, because then it would become a matter of extradition up to the governor, who of course is his contender, Ron DeSantis, actually, who's heavily involved in all this.
Who had already said that he wouldn't
extradite
him,
But what's interesting about these, at the time that he was first arrested and indicted, before we knew what the charges were, everybody from the CNN to the BBC said, well, these actually, on the face of it, these are misdemeanors rather than felonies, but we don't yet know the charges. We'll know the charges in a day or two, and that will really reveal why these are actually serious crimes, criminal felonies. And then now that we know all the 34 charges, they're left with egg on their face, because they've actually said, oh yes, well these are actually the same things that we assumed 2 days ago. So there actually is very little evidence here on the ground. But what this also does, I think, is it goes to another situation, which is the complete imbalance and disproportionate treatment that people on the Republican side get from the establishment in America, by which I mean Department of Justice and the FBI. look, we have Trump going with Mar-a-Lago for classified information, but you also had General Petraeus, Republican, who was indicted for having classified information on his laptop. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton had a whole server in her home, chock-a-block full of classified information, and nothing happened on that front. We had the scandalous cover-up of the Hunter Biden laptop, which was suppressed by social media and by the media and by the government for fear of damaging Joe Biden's efforts to win the presidency. And yet at the same time, we had so much attention given to the alleged Russian collusion of Team Trump, which of course amounted to nothing. It was all smoke and mirrors. There was no grounds for that at all. So I think on every level here, you can see how the justice, which is supposed to be blind and have a scale, has got one thumb clearly on one side of those scales.
It's like this is the absolute apotheosis, isn't it, of this Trump derangement, the absolute hatred.
Absolutely.
That's been there since he was, and before, since he was elected.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can deny that, frankly. It's impossible to say that there isn't this sort of visceral antipathy towards Trump. And you mentioned earlier about how can anyone possibly vote for Trump. Well, I seem to recall that the Daily Mirror said exactly the same thing about Bush Jr.
Yes.
Also about Reagan, even going back even further. How can the Americans be so stupid to vote for someone as ridiculous as this? So that really goes back to my point about we invariably see and judge as we would our own politicians, and the United States is very different.
Yes, I mean, there is this thing, isn't there? It's happening, well, it's the case here in Britain too, possibly even in Europe generally now. We take a lot of opinions, don't we, from New York, Los Angeles, Washington, pretty much, hate him en masse, don't they? But in fact, we don't hear, do we, about this huge, mass of people who basically don't have access maybe to the media so much, who absolutely adore him. And all the things that we might find that we recoil at are the very things they love about him, aren't they?
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that front, and of course, but it works equally well the other way too. So I've got lots of friends in Canada and America who are saying, "How on earth could you elect this clown Boris Johnson?" Because all that they see about him, of course, are the salacious, sensational aspects of his life, without actually understanding the real dynamic issues on the ground that made him appealing. The Heineken beer reaching parts of the electorate other politicians can't reach. And that was Trump's skill too. He was a great communicator, and he was giving voice. I mean, the irony: a billionaire giving voice to the concerns of the marginalized and the poor in America. But of course, I think all of this actually, in a way, I'm sure Trump is secretly relishing this to a degree, because of course he is the great and the only great reality TV president America's ever had. He's cut his teeth in Worldwide Wrestling and in The Apprentice. And he's always talking about his ratings when he was president. And to have a set piece here, it's sort of judge, jury, or the people's court, isn't it? It's another reality set for him to actually pummel the opposition. And we've seen some hints of that with the tweets he's been putting out about the Attorney General, even about the judge. It's never a good idea to criticise your judge, but he's gone down that path too.
Trump-hating judge. And the guy who's actually the Attorney General is somebody called Alvin Bragg, isn't he?
That's right.
As you said,
no relation to Melvin. Right?
No, or Billy. Let's hope. But, remember how Reagan, was thought of? Again, people thought that, the Americans had reached some kind of nadir with Reagan because he couldn't string to. Now he's considered to be one of the great presidents. He's sort of considered to be statesman-like. And in fact, when you look at him now and you look at him on YouTube clips, he's quite funny, he's witty, but he mocks himself. He mocks himself in a way that I think Trump could never do, could he? He's just totally incapable of that.
I think Reagan, to be fair to him, he had a lot of good people around him, and he listened, and he was a good judge on where to take advice and where not to take advice, and he had a lot of charm. I don't think that's something that Trump can be accused of, unfortunately. He's got other characteristics that may appeal to a lot of people, but charm is not one of them. And Reagan was extraordinarily charming and witty, and in a way that was part of Boris Johnson's attraction as well. Very witty, very clever, and able really to talk to anyone, despite his background. And let's not forget that while Trump was a billionaire, a millionaire, there was Boris from Eton, from Oxford, the Bullington Club and the rest of it, but also able to have a good, homely chat with someone standing at the bar. Bit like Farage. Perhaps that should tell our politicians something, that they ought to develop their charm skills.
But also remember, Reagan actually definitively stood for something. This was a man of ideological principle, along with Thatcher and along with the Pope. You know, the three great global figures who caused the destruction of communism from the outside, along with the internal forces. But this was a man who actually was generally interested in issues and saw a purpose and a mission for himself and his administration, which I don't think you've seen reflected in later presidencies. And he was also, of course, governor of California originally,
as a Democrat.
As a Democrat, but this was a man who was skilled, had the experience there. But of course, and as an actor, one can't, you have to be an actor in politics. And to have him there as a great communicator, I think the best communicator since, well, you can say JFK, but I would say since Roosevelt in his fireside chats, win one for the Gipper, when you had the Challenger crash, when they slipped the surly bonds of earth. I mean, the most wonderful phrases delivered in that most homely sort of American way, with grandeur and status, but also touching a real nerve in the American hearts.
And I also, as a child of the Cold War, I don't think that Reagan is given sufficient appreciation of what he did to bring down communism. Having worked behind the Iron Curtain, I think that the greatest development in the 21st century, in the 20th century, was the fall of the wall and the end of communism, which I think was as abhorrent as a development in human development as anything.
And that's why, of course, you have in Budapest a statue
I was about to say,
of Ronald Reagan too. Yeah, absolutely.
And also Thatcher, absolutely adored in the Eastern Bloc. I remember there's a story about Reagan. There are many stories about Reagan, but this was one case where he was at the press conference. I think in those days they didn't have one every day, did they? But he was with journalists. He was very, as I said, self-mocking. And one of these journalists asked, Mr. President, what are you going to do about the national debt? And he replied, well, I think the national debt is quite big enough to look after itself. Which I think is so funny.
On that note, can I shift it slightly to George Bush Senior?
Yes.
And the fact that he lost to someone who was a manifest liar, someone who had looked to camera and said something that was totally wrong, and yet he lost to him. I mean, Bill Clinton, I think, really was as unpleasant. His character was unpleasant as anything that Trump can present. Can I also mention, if I may, the fact that I once had a pee together with President Bush Senior.
Really? Oh, well, okay. Yes, of course you can mention it.
Well, it was.
I'm sure we'll get letters.
It was a NATO conference. Yeah. It was taking place at Lancaster House, and the heads of government were all there. This was 1990, including Margaret Thatcher, who was wonderful. And I went to relieve myself in the very old-fashioned urinal in Lancaster House. And as I was standing there, all of a sudden I became aware of the fact that there were these heavies with hands under their lapels, their jackets, walking in. And with that, next thing I know, President Bush was standing next to me.
Good Lord.
And he said, howdy. And I said, how do you do, Mr. President? I won't say what I was doing with my hands. So I genuinely once had a pee with President Bush.
Well, very few people.
President of the United
Can
States.
I do urinal anecdote as we're on this? It's apocryphal, but of Clement Attlee having a pee at one of the urinals in the Houses of Parliament, and Churchill was supposed to have walked in, and he went to the farthest end from as you could get from Attlee, and Clement finished his business, buttoned himself up, and said, "Winston, why have you gone all the way over to that side?" And Churchill was alleged to have said, "No offence, Clement, but whenever you see anything large and in good working order, you want to nationalise it." Not true, I suspect, but a good joke nonetheless.
Well, on that note, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, no, I think as you say, a kind of humanity, a hinterland. These people had a hinterland to them, which I think you don't get now. I think, when you look forward and back to Reagan, I'm intensely nostalgic about that period of Thatcher and Reagan now, because it wasn't just words. You really did feel we were, on the sense that we were triumphant, and it was a wonderful time actually in America. And when you look forward to now, the next election, it is extraordinary, isn't it? But there really is a very possible chance that there could be serious civil convulsion if Trump loses or wins, or indeed if Biden loses and wins. I'm not saying it's all down to Trump at all, but all the elections really over the past 10 years have been delegitimized, haven't they? The whole process has lost its authority. I mean, do you think there really could be some kind of violence in America?
No.
Really? See, I think it's
genuinely
changed
don't.
so much, Alp.
I mean, there may be the odd bit of activity, I don't know, resistance, some manifestation of people's dissatisfaction. But I don't think that ultimately even the Americans, as they are now, would actually turn against each other in the way that would encourage this sort of deeper embroiling.
I don't know what do you think? I mean,
I agree with Alp. I don't see this as being akin to the American Civil War. For one very good reason, if not for any others, people today are not willing to lay their lives down for any political cause.
Right.
You wouldn't see, the youth of today would never agree to conscription, for example. I think the age of conscription has died a death throughout the Western world, so we'll never see that sort of your call-up papers coming. So I don't see any sort of conflict on those levels. Plus, of course, the division between the two sides in America is so geographically based that how on earth would the two sides actually come into physical contact with each other when you've got the two coasts and then you've got the core in the centre? Yes, you may get skirmishes, you may get a rise in, perhaps, as we've seen in the past, of terrorist activity, homegrown terrorism. You may see more sort of Antifa-type activities occurring, but those tend to occur, of course, in Democrat states themselves. It's always pillaging and destroying your own turf, San Francisco, New York, and so forth. So I'm not optimistic, and I don't see any way in which that fissure that divides American society can be healed within our lifetimes. I don't see how that could possibly happen, but I think it's going to be more of a segregation of America into the two camps, with no interaction with each other, existing side by side, not peacefully, but not violently.
I suppose that's what I really thought meant by that. It's essentially urban disruption, just like we had with Black Lives Matter. I mean, but maybe more intense. But I wasn't necessarily suggesting a civil war in that way. But I think that it's a shocking. I mean, the transformation culturally is extraordinary, and I mean, causes me real dismay, actually.
Yeah.
Because I grew up absolutely adoring, and indeed it was a big part of my life, America.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Peter, because I don't think in Europe we are mindful enough of the fact that we owe our stability, our wealth in Europe, the security that we've enjoyed over the last 70 years is because of the Americans. Had it not been for the Americans, frankly, we would all be speaking Russian now.
Yes.
And that is something that is very often forgotten.
Yes. Well, we shall see. Do we really have to wait until December the 4th for another sort of development in this?
Well, maybe there's court backlogs in every country. It does take a long time, normally, but that's.
Well, while we're waiting on that, we can discuss what happened this week on the grooming gang, rape gang, whatever you want to call them. quite rightly, they should never be out of the news, in my view, but they've come back into the news. Basically, the government now is setting up a task force, a police special task force, and I think both Suella Braverman and also Rishi Sunak have said that, in fact, we cannot let political correctness get in the way of the reporting or indeed the charging in this area of grooming gangs. This, of course, has led to the left, particularly on social media, absolutely up in arms, and Diane Abbott and usual suspects, basically saying this is most of it's white and everything. Do you think it will? Do you think the penny has finally dropped with the government on this, or is this yet more sort of we will do this and we will do that and then nothing happening?
Well, first of all, I think that we should stop taking too much heed of what Diane Abbott says.
Right,
I know she's
very popular on the
she's
channel.
an institution and all that, but we really must stop taking what the likes of Diane Abbott say as seriously as we do. Secondly, I just hope that the government is not embarking on yet more efforts to push things a little bit into the deep grass, into the long grass. If this task group or whatever it is actually going to function as it should, and it's going to be able to make decisions, and whatever conclusions it arrives at them quickly, and the government acts on them, fine. I'm sure that Suella Braverman actually does mean it. Realistically, looking at the time frame of what's likely to come out, whether or not they're going to act on it, how much debate is going to take place, how much the left, and right for that matter, come out against what is being said and what is being proposed, and what we arrive at the very end of the process, at that point, I think it will already be too late, frankly.
Yes, I think that one of the important points is that they are encouraging the police now to be much more open about the ethnicity of perpetrators. Well, actually, generally, but in this case with grooming gangs. I would just add, before I ask what you think, Rafe, is that apparently the police have been able to do this for some time, and they just haven't. And I mean, this is what I find fascinating about this, that the power was there, to actually show ethnicity in terms of these grooming gangs, but it simply wasn't used.
Yeah, I'll come to that point in a minute, but you're quite right. The two most important parts of this proposed legislation are to actually ensure that there's recording of the ethnicities here. One of the reasons that you have this debate about how many Pakistani heritage individuals are involved in this is because we don't actually know, because the police are failing to report. That's what skews the statistics in one direction. The other important thing here is that there is a move now in this legislation to actually criminalise those in the social services and elsewhere who fail to report sexual abuse. Now, I'm amazed that hasn't been done before.
Yeah.
If you know that a girl is being sexually abused, to sit on that fact in order to avoid stoking racial tensions, I think that clearly should be a criminal offence. But isn't it remarkable, I have to say, that after 10 years plus of Tory rule, now suddenly we've got the government taking a strong stance on gender identity in schools. We've got suddenly a strong stance, allegedly, on channel crossings, a strong stance about emptying hotels of asylum seekers, and now here, all a few months away from a general election.
Yes.
Samuel Johnson once said, "When a man knows he's going to be hanged in 2 weeks, it concentrates the mind wonderfully."
Yes.
And one might think that's probably Tory policy now. It's too little, it's too late. If these are all of those measures I discussed, from gender identity to asylum seeking to here with rape gangs, I refuse to call them grooming gangs. Let's call them what they are.
Yeah.
They're all very sensible policies. If they had been enacted 10 years ago, and if we had had them built upon over the course of the past 10 years, my gosh, what a better life and society we would have in this country. Because it has been the last 10 years when these grooming gang things really first came to light. Well, it's actually 20 years ago, but it's been the last 10 years with that, with the gender issues, with migration, that all of these things have actually really come to the fore and have divided society and caused so much damage and distrust in our institutions, and so much of it could have been dealt with properly if we'd had a true Tory government in power since 2010 onwards.
Yeah, I don't think it should be just a Tory government, frankly. I know that the Labour Party, they've espoused the sort of policies, or they've hesitated in some cases of engaging in the sort of policies that they know and their constituents know, frankly, are the right ones. I think that this is not something that should become, the protection of my granddaughters, really, of children. That's what we're talking about, is protecting those who are most vulnerable, who are the weakest parts of our society, susceptible to these sort of attacks from heinous individuals. I abhor them. I really do. The government should be doing something about it.
Yes,
without needing legislation, frankly.
Oh well, yes, but you've got to have the will. And I mean, you're quite right. It's come to light sport in the mainstream. Andrew Norfolk in the Times around about 2010, right? But you know, they
2003, I think he was.
No, it was 2000.
Oh no, that's right. You're right.
2010. But basically, in terms of it going on, it's about a generation's worth.
Yeah.
So we don't even really know quite how much. But I totally agree with you. Who could not agree with what you said there, Alp? But you are talking about, I would say, a racially aggravated, situation here. These girls were picked because they were white.
Yeah, and the reason
they were, that's a hate crime.
The reason I single out the Tories is because we expect the Tories to actually be tough on these sorts of issues, whereas we know that the Labour Party's track record, and it's never been strong on this, and we know full well what it's done to those Labour MPs who have actually raised this issue. We had 20 years ago, we had that lady MP who raised the issue first, the one that Andrew Norfolk was involved with. She was castigated.
Anne Cryer.
And then following that, 10 years ago, you had Jack Straw raising this, and he was shut down. And then you had, worst of all, you had Sarah Champion, the MP for Rotherham, who was terribly treated by Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. So the Labour Party have a track record here, and they know full well that whenever these issues are discussed, people tend to go over to vote for Tory once these issues become real and relevant. And that's, I think, a lot of the thinking here. It's not entirely motivated by good sense, by good motivations. There's also a clear political reason for that. Suella Braverman, of all people, is saying this because she knows when she speaks, she gets the issue onto the front pages. And the more that these issues are discussed, the more people reject the Labour Party and come over to the Tory side. So discussing these issues is actually very good for getting more people to come to vote for Tory.
Cynical, in other words, purely cynical.
Well, you've been a politician, Peter. Would you have ever hesitated from advocating the right policies for fear of losing votes?
Well, I mean, that's like saying, when did you stop beating your wife? No, I mean, no. But then our whole position when we were involved in politics, for Brexit, was we were not in a case of losing. We were always sort of like in a situation where we were facing hostility, so it was a question of keeping our end up, and trying to gather votes to our cause. It wasn't a case, in a way, of changing your tune just simply to get more votes. We had the cause, if you like, a bit like a pressure group or a think tank. We had the cause, and we just needed to get as many people along with that as possible.
Yeah, but I suppose that's my point, that when we're talking about rape gangs, grooming gangs, well, whatever you care to call them, where they're from, what their ethnic origins are, if you're hesitating, if you're not engaging in the debate, and frankly it shouldn't be a debate, it should be perfectly obvious what needs to happen. But if you're not even engaging in the debate for fear of attracting sort of opprobrium from your side, then that is an awful indictment of the state of our politics.
Absolutely, but I mean, what was it that MP, tweeted or liked to tweet saying, why don't they just shut up for the sake of diversity? Remember?
Yeah.
It was a Labour politician. That sort of sums it up in a way. We can't rock the multicultural boat. That is what one of the MPs said from one of those areas. the big problem with this, it seems to me, is that, the Tories will look at the red wall and they will think it's about, economics or whatever. It's actually this kind of problem.
Well, I think they realise that now.
It's
Well,
this
the
kind of
Tory
problem.
MPs from the red wall understand all of that. But of course, the issue here, and you have people on the left saying that, Braverman and Sunak are stoking the culture wars. There would be no culture war on this issue if actually the public institutions had taken a firm stand. The reason you get extreme reactions to all of this is because people are sitting there looking open-mouthed at the failure and inability and downright dereliction of duty, and of duty of safeguarding too, of children by social services, by councils, by police. If you can't rely on our public institutions to actually defend children, there's no surprise that the people are going to rise up and do that. So the culture wars are being stoked because of the inability of these Labour MPs and others to actually take a firm stand on what's going in their own communities. And whilst it's good to see that the Conservative government is finally, in the last hour or before they get executed, take a stand on this issue, the problem is they haven't brought along with them the councils, they haven't brought along with them the police, they haven't brought along with them the social workers, who still refuse to actually condemn these activities, who still refuse to let the public know what's going on, the amount of cover-ups that are still taking place in what is the greatest scandal of the century, I think we can say, undoubtedly, and the fact that you have the police being forced to actually record ethnicities, because even though they have the power, they're failing to do it. When you have terrible examples of social workers who refuse to report child abuse, this is still going on, and people are still acting under. After a decade, this is still going on, I should say, and that's the ultimate scandal here.
I think. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned diversity, Peter, but it's a sort of a faux, false diversity. It's okay to champion everyone, bar one particular group.
Oh, of course.
And that is what's so wrong about it.
Well, that's the whole point.
The young, white, vulnerable girls, really, it's okay, because that's tantamount to accepting that it is okay by avoiding actually drawing attention to it, by noting the ethnicity of the individuals concerned. And for goodness sake, we end up having to declare our ethnicity if we go to our GP, if we, whatever we're doing nowadays.
Even when you buy theatre tickets,
you've got 120 to choose from.
Yes.
And yet, if you say that you are white, if you say that you are female, if you say that you are underage, somehow that doesn't matter.
I suppose the
It's
only
wrong.
thing, I think we might have answered the question in a way. The only thing that sort of slightly perplexes me, maybe I'm being too harsh here, is that if this was happening industrially, which we know it was, to young girls, where were the men? Why did they not? You'd think that they would rise up, if you know what I mean.
You mean local men?
Yes, you'd think that they would sort of like go out en masse, but what happened? I mean,
well, it's often the case that
be
these are
arrested.
single parent households as well. This is quite often the case.
That's
but
true.
But I also want to say, of course, this is not just about grooming gangs. With mass migration, we've also had a disturbing rise in a whole slew of offences that we would regard as barbaric. Honour killings on the rise, acid attacks on the rise. Did you know that female genital mutilation on the rise? And did you know that the Metropolitan Police actually have a unit dedicated to witchcraft because of crimes being occurred, exorcisms with terrible torture of children, in a couple of cases involving deaths? These are all things which are happening under our very noses, even in the big metropolis of London, which the public don't know about because stymied and stifled by the same political correctness, our media and others don't talk about it. Yet we get reams of coverage in the newspaper about a drunken MP who puts a hand on a boy's knee, or someone who's groped at a party. That gets wall-to-wall coverage for a week. And yet you have the industrial scale abuse of children in this country being sidelined by everybody except small organisations like the New Culture Forum and GB News.
yes. Well,
Absolutely.
no.
And Migration Watch.
And Migration
Migration Watch, yes, I
How
was
could I
just
forget Migration
about
Watch?
to say that,
Absolutely.
yes. We've got to end, but I just want a few comments. William Hague wrote a piece in the Times this week, basically saying artificial intelligence, AI, which is slowly dawning on us in the mainstream. It's slowly dawning on us that this is a thing. That basically we have really seriously kind of got to get a grip on it and regulate it, because otherwise we're done for. And I just wondered what you thought about it, if you've given any thought at all. I automatically, and I'm really not a Luddite, but this brings out the Luddite in me. The idea that somehow or other we will be at the mercy of a greater intelligence. Does it worry you?
I don't think that's going to happen in your and my lifetime. Not that sort of threat really posed to civilization as we know it. The bone of contention I have with AI is that you can't sit down and have this sort of discussion with it. What is it exactly that we're heading towards, that all decisions are made about anything really, instead of having a parliament passing laws and having a framework structure of a legal framework? We're going to have machines that we push facts into, and they will come up with solutions and say, this is what you need to do. If that is the case, then I think we control the people who are doing the typing.
Yes.
But if machines, whatever, computers, are going to be able to think for themselves and decide what it is that Rafe is going to do or Peter's going to do, then that's a different matter. Are we really heading in that direction?
I think, solutions one thing, right? What I think I can't bear is the fact that almost all human functions will be able to be done and better, such as, apparently even now you can already sort of say, can you paint me a picture of this room in the style of Renoir? And it will come back pretty much like a Renoir. I don't like the idea of that. I think, that people say, you can't disinvent things and all the rest of it. But actually, maybe why not? Why can't you?
Well, I don't give two hoots what William Hague has to say about computers. About when you have Elon Musk, and you've had Stephen Hawking before he died, and you've got Steve Wozniak, and you have Bill Gates, all warning and saying, let's put a pause for 6 months at least on this issue and get some idea of regulation, and let's look to see the actual potential downsides of this. I think you have to pay attention, because none of us, and most people watching this, are as qualified in computers as an Elon Musk or a Stephen Hawking or Steve Wozniak. And so I think if these people are actually trying to draw attention to the potential damages that could be done, I think we need to pay attention. I'm not saying stop things. I'm not a Luddite either. There are huge beneficial impacts that you'll get from AI. But there's nothing wrong with actually saying, let's actually just take a breather and see how this goes. But at the end of the day, there are huge problems, right? Of course, we know full well that now I went to law school. Writing the LSAT in North America is a very complicated exam to write. Now AI can get a 90% on that, which is unimaginable for a student to get. You've got students now submitting essays written by ChatGPT, which teachers can't test for plagiarism. There are whole issues over there. All the future-proofed industries people went to do, in computers and so forth, are now at threat. Everything. No one's going to mind the death of lawyers, but lawyers will go. Surgeons even will there. Yeah. So it's the white-collar professions as much as anything else.
They're coming for you.
But they're all going to be coming for. But I actually think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what we say here in the West. We can regulate up to our back teeth, because China won't be having the same issues about regulation that we do. And there actually are, one of the ideas is to put human beliefs into AI to regulate it. Human morals, basically. I don't imagine the Chinese will be putting their human morals into their AI. And when you get things like nanotechnology alongside it, which actually could, in theory, turn the planet into grey goo through self-replicating machines, which we won't get into. Once you have AI and nanotechnology combined together, there are some doomsday scenarios, and it may not be within our lifetimes to get to that degree, but I think a lot of these probably bad sides will be becoming apparent within our lifetimes. Things happen very quickly in AI. We've already got to this stage where you can replicate pictures of the Pope wearing a white puffer jacket.
That's right, yes.
And everyone thinks that they're real. That's happened in the space of a few months. I am just very wary of what's going to happen over the next few years. Look how far we've come since the advent of the internet in the 1990s to today. AI is as big as the internet. It's perhaps as big as the nuclear age. And you just remember what Robert Oppenheimer said when he had his first nuclear launch. He said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." So let's just be careful and wary.
I have to say, I know a little bit about it as well. The average person in the street knows zilch. Let's actually explain a little bit more about what is happening, what the risks are, and whether people actually want it to happen and go in that direction. That isn't happening at the moment.
Well, the show has been brought to you by AI. We're not actually here.
I am.
Alp, thank you very much. Rafe, thanks very much. That's it for this week. We shall see you next time on Newspeak. Thanks. Bye-bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.